Okay, the title of the book, Taking Sides in Revolutionary Jersey, it's about people, because that's what I'm curious about, is people and what happened to people during and after the revolution. Caught in the Crossfire was actually suggested by my friend, Joseph Klett. And it turned out to be really also very appropriate, because as I did my research, I found more than one person who was, during the Revolutionary War, literally caught in the crossfire, with the British firing over his house in one direction or at him, and then the Patriots firing from the other direction. So this, a lot of people were caught during the war, and especially people around here. And I'll come back, I hope, to that. I also want to say that I always add or give local examples that are not in the book, which I think is sometimes dangerous, because I'm sure there's people in the audience who know more examples than I do, if they're local. But I have included some local examples for today as well. Okay, first, let me see. Yeah. Wait a minute. No, I'm missing some. Oh, wait a minute. Okay. Thought I went too fast. All right, so I added 2 maps because I know I'm a historian and I work on this period and I get confused. So you have to remember that there were only 13 counties in New Jersey at the time of the American Revolution. And for me, this is particularly confusing when it comes to the Hopewell Valley, because I always think, yeah, Trenton's part of Mercer County. Trenton's not part of Hunterdon County. Well, it doesn't work that way, because the boundaries were all totally different. And sometimes the names of the towns were different back then too. And I do, at the beginning of my book, have a list of some of the ones that I found with the old names and then the new names. And I have to confess, I've been writing with pen or pencil some additions in my copy of the book, because I keep finding more examples. But anyway, you can see the 13 counties at the time, and then you can also see the map of Hunterdon County as it would have been in 1775. Even closer? No, that's okay. And that's the cover, which has a picture of the Battle of Trenton, because the Revolutionary War in New Jersey was really very violent, with constant battles back and forth. But I also wanted to include this because they weren't all in open areas and fields and stuff like this. But this was, at the time, a more...
Your slides, Bruce. The slides have not gone over yet, Max. Trying to get the TV working.
I'm not controlling that. Okay. You want to keep talking, or you want to wait for the next slide? Ah,
you can keep going.
okay, I'll just keep going. This is not the first time I've had a glitch when I've given a talk. It's happened before. Okay, so anyway, the book, I picked Trenton, and I picked this image because I thought it was a good one. This is just the chapters in the book. I'm more or less going to follow the same pattern talking today. So I'm going to go through and talk about the Patriots and so on, the Quakers and Loyalists and so on, and I'll explain as I go through. I always start with Richard Stockton, because he's what got me started on this topic. And it's got to be, I think, more than 20 years ago. Probably even more than that, actually. But anyway, I had a class that did research. I was teaching a seminar and had them do research on the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And then comes up the information saying that Richard Stockton was the only signer to take it back. And I'm like, well, there are a lot of interesting stories, but what is this about? And it just really captured my curiosity, I guess is the best way to. So I started working on Richard Stockton, and I'll talk about a little bit about him in a second. But also, as I proceeded and started to look at what's happening during the Revolution, I realized that I couldn't just talk about the Patriots. I had to talk about people like Stockton, who was caught in the middle. I had to talk about Quakers, and I really had to talk about the Loyalists, because I don't understand the revolution unless you talk about all the different sides people took, which is what the book really evolved into. And Richard Stockton graduated. He was from a Princeton area family. They were originally Quakers. By the time of the Revolution, they were Presbyterians. He's one of those who graduated in the first graduating class of, well, then the College of New Jersey, now Princeton. He was Presbyterian, a lawyer, a judge, a member of the Royal Council until he resigned as the Revolution started, a signer of the Declaration of Independence for New Jersey. He was captured in Monmouth County, fled from Princeton as the British were approaching, and captured in Monmouth County. And there were a lot of loyalists in Monmouth County, but they weren't all loyalists in the Freehold area. There were also patriots, but the loyalists were out looking, and they captured him. He was imprisoned in New York City in the middle of the winter, fall into January of 1777. He, by all accounts, signed an oath of allegiance to the king to get released, and he was in ill health when he was released. But, and this is where the revolution is so complicated, no matter who you look at, it gets more complicated. And he went back to Princeton, and he did, about a year later, take an oath of allegiance to New Jersey and to the new United States. And he helped, or tried to help, certainly the College of New Jersey, and the family tried to help people who had been imprisoned by the British, because I'm sure he told them how terrible the conditions were. And I think the latest books on those who were imprisoned on ships in New York Harbor estimate that at least 50%, if not more, died. So this was a bad time, bad place to be. And for years, I've told my students, you would not want to have lived in New Jersey during the American Revolution. And I think you wouldn't have wanted to be in this area because it also faced a lot of destruction and people going back and forth. Okay, next, there's no one explanation. You can't take one category and say, okay, this will work. There's no one explanation for the reasons people took the sides they did. Ideology, no taxation without representation. This was important versus the idea that the king and parliament were supreme. And I think as a lawyer, some of this resonated with Stockton and with other people like him. Another reason was economic, the cost of British regulations, the tariffs, the laws that they passed coming in the upcoming or beginning of the revolution. Religion, which I think in New Jersey was actually really important. In some other places, it wasn't. New Jersey had a very diverse population, and sometimes the choices that people made were really because of religion. Presbyterians, Baptists, I'm trying to think of, those are the main groups that are Presbyterians. The British said that this was a Presbyterian revolution. College of New Jersey, now Princeton, was a Presbyterian institution. Its president was the only minister to sign the Declaration of Independence. And this was important. The figure for those who went to the college before and during the revolution, the statistic is that 98% were patriots. This is simply not true of any other institution that existed at the time. So religion was important, and not just for the Presbyterians, but also, I said, for the Baptists, for some of the Quakers. This was actually an important issue. Family. I'm convinced sometimes you can figure out what side they took by who their daughters married. Did their daughters marry British officers? Well, yeah, and then sometimes the family is loyalist. But you can't tell. No one thing works. And some families were united. The Stocktons were overwhelmingly patriots. And sometimes families divided bitterly. And the most obvious example, of course, is Benjamin Franklin and his son, William Franklin, who was the last royal governor of New Jersey. So again, there's no one category that really works. Economic. It's not just the cost of British measures, which I have here, but also it was, for some historians have said, keeping slaves or not keeping slaves, as this increasingly became an issue. It was not wealthy versus people who were less wealthy, because there's a number of very wealthy New Jersey figures that are prominent in the revolution. So you can't just automatically, and I think historians were inclined at one point to say this, you can't say the rich were against the revolution and the poor were for it. It doesn't work. It just simply doesn't. It's more complicated than that. And last, resentment. Patriot pressure to conform sometimes led people to become loyalists. They resented the pressure. On the other side, the British pressure, and especially devastation, when they marched through, and this was true in the Hopewell Valley, when they marched through, they destroyed property, they raped young women. This was nasty. And this led people to want to fight against the British. So resentment becomes really an important matter, an important issue as well. And then, yeah, this is my one way of helping to sort of understand how religion becomes an important issue in New Jersey, because it has a diverse population. It's not like some other places that are more united in their background. And they did not want a bishop, an Anglican bishop, to come. They did not want an established church. New Jersey never had an established church from the time it was founded in the 17th century. And so you had all of these groups that didn't want it to be uniformly Anglican, controlling marriages and who gets appointed, the minister, and so on and so forth. Two of the leaders to have an Anglican bishop were New Jersey ministers, Anglican ministers, Jonathan Odell and I always get the name wrong. Oh, Thomas. People have three names. I get confused, right? Thomas Bradbury Chandler writes the most, and they're both actually really strong advocates. So they both want to have an Anglican bishop. Okay, patriots. I had an image here. It disappeared when I was revising the PowerPoint. I did have an image, and I think it's from the local church, and it was his gravestone. And it's somewhere on my computer, but it's disappeared. It's not here. But this was the local minister in Pennington. And he was he was a Presbyterian, and he was a patriot. And the British raided his house, destroyed his paper, and he died shortly after. You can't see because of my picture, but he died shortly after the revolution. But he was among those who supported it. And if I remember reading, I think he may have been one of the men from the area who guided Washington and his forces to Trenton to fight in the Battle of Trenton. He came from Massachusetts and he served the church in Hopewell for 47 years. The other one, whose name is actually, yeah, I saw it's pronounced Guile. I know, I look at it and I'm like, I read somewhere it's pronounced Guile. Yes. Okay, and then the other local person who I'm sure most of you would recognize the name is John Hart. And I never could find a picture of him, or the ones that I found, people say, well, it's probably not really him. It's hard. It's absolutely hard when you're working in this period. There's one picture, I'm not top of my head. I'm not going to think of the name right now, which I keep getting questions, can we use this? I'm like, no, you can't use it. That's her daughter. That's not her. That's her daughter. So I was kind of happy when I found this image of the monument to him. also in the church in Pennington. But John Hart was a cousin of Richard Stockton, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. During the war, he served in the New Jersey Assembly, on the Council of Safety, and in the loan office, which means he signed, I think they hand signed every piece of paper money that was printed, which if you think about money today, it's like, what? But when you look at it, they were all hand signed. He and his neighbors hosted the Patriot Army when they were moving from Philadelphia across New Jersey towards what turned into the Battle of Monmouth. And by all accounts, his farmland and theirs was basically shredded by the troops who came and stayed there on their way to begin that battle. He died before the war was over. Most of his family apparently left afterwards. People owed him money and there was no way to collect it. The family was poor after the war than before. And it's very interesting when you start looking, it doesn't matter what side people took in the revolution, whether they were patriots or loyalists or tried to stay neutral, people lost a lot of property because the war was more devastating in New Jersey than anywhere else because more of the fighting took place in New Jersey than anywhere else. So the figures are really kind of scary. Okay, African Americans also fought in the revolution on both sides. Most of the stories that you see usually are about those who fought for the British, who went off to get their freedom and joined the British. It didn't always work that way, but also if you fought for the Americans, you didn't always get your freedom either. And so one of the more interesting examples, because it's really well documented, is Samuel Stutphin. He filed a claim for a pension in 1833 because he had served in different times during the war. He was turned down before this. He was not African-American enslaved, I should have said. He was turned down for the pension, as most of the African-Americans were who had fought in the war, because it was hard for them to prove their service. But in this case, there were politicians, including the governor, that knew him, and they came to his aid, and the state actually passed a special law to provide him with a pension. He didn't live much longer, but he did in the last few years of his life get a pension, recognizing that he had fought during the war. Then there are those who I call the straddlers, the trimmers, and the opportunists. And the best sort of explanation for this was a poem by Francis Hopkinson. And Francis Hopkinson lived in Bordentown. He was from Pennsylvania, but he lived in Bordentown. He was one of the New Jersey signers of the Declaration of Independence. And when the British went through, they burnt, I think, his mother-in-law's house. They burned the Bordens because they were well-known, very strong patriots. Anyway, he wrote this poem. He wrote a number of poems, usually poking fun at the British. And some of them were set to songs. But there's one that I found called The Birds, the Beast, and the Bat. Okay, the birds are the patriots. So you can see the eagle. The beast is the British. And then the trimmers are the bat. And he says in the poem, well, the bat was half bird, half beast. And he was there during the revolution. But when pressed, he said, no, I'm a flying mouse. So trimming, trying to have both sides. So as an example of this, I picked Tench Koch. Because in part, the Koch family is really important in this area because they claimed much land and their titles to the land became much disputed. And one of the things I sort of discovered, and I still can't wrap my head around it, I don't understand it, is a member of the family 50 years after the revolution comes back and lays claim to some other land, and a judge agrees with her. And I'm like, that makes no sense to me, because your husband very clearly said he was a loyalist, but they still recognized her claim to some of the land. Tench Khatri is a member of this family. As a young man, he was in Philadelphia when the British were in Philadelphia, when the British occupied Philadelphia. And he he sided with the British, he helped with the British, and he certainly was seen as a loyalist. In fact, he was even arrested. And somehow he was pardoned. And I can't prove it, but I was convinced the judge knew the family. This was, also made no sense unless you kind of think about it that way. And then he became a Whig. So he'd been a loyalist. He was in Philadelphia helping the British, and then he became a Whig, affiliated with the Patriots. At the Annapolis Convention in 1786, he was a Patriot representing Pennsylvania. Then, after 1788, when the Constitution was adopted, he was a Federalist. He became the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, working under Alexander Hamilton, so a very prominent Federalist. And then, lo and behold, all of a sudden, he was a Jeffersonian Democrat. And he was given the name of Mr. Facing Both Ways. So I could talk about the Cox family in other ways, but I'm like, this is a good example of trimmer, straddler, opportunist, whatever you want to call him, because I think it fits. Okay, and then the Quakers. New Jersey had a substantial population of Quakers, not as big as Pennsylvania, but it still had a substantial population of Quakers. The Quakers were pacifists. Well, at least most of them were. Remember, there's always an exception. There's no one rule that kind of works when you start looking at people in the Revolution. And the Quakers also were regarded with a great deal of suspicion, because in 1776, the overseeing meeting for the Quakers, basically remember, it's all the colonies, said that only God can change the government. So they're seen as siding with the king because of that statement. And interestingly enough, not all of the Quakers were pacifists. And I'll come back and give you some examples in a minute. But I also want to give you two examples that help show how complicated it could be if you were a Quaker. And I should add, you were supposed to pay taxes, but the Quaker meeting said, no, you can't pay. That's not the legitimate government. You can't pay taxes. You can't you can't serve in the army. You can't go to any parades. You can't show any loyalty of any kind. You're supposed to remain neutral. And of course, if you didn't pay your taxes, you could be in trouble with your neighbors and so on and so forth. So life became really complicated if you were a Quaker, but they didn't all take exactly the same side. Ann Cooper Whittle lived in this house. This is Battle of Red Bank took place right around the house. Part of their property was used by the Patriots. And she was caught literally in the middle of the battle during the battle, and is supposed to has a reputation of having been in the basement, helping take care of the wounded, whether they were Patriot or British or loyalists. She's helping take care of them, and scolding them for fighting the whole time. So she took this serious. Apparently, one of her sons was a Patriot soldier in that battle. Gets really complicated. She had two brothers, and the brothers' names were John Cooper and David Cooper. And the brothers agreed about abolition, that there should be no more slavery. And the Quakers, after about 1775, you weren't supposed to still be a Quaker if you had slaves. So it becomes an important issue. So they agreed about no more slavery. But they didn't agree about what you could do and couldn't do living here in the middle of a war. So John Cooper served actually in the legislature, New Jersey legislature during the war, and he was disowned by the Quakers for doing this because he took a side and you were supposed to be neutral. And his brother, I'm not sure they talked to each other after that. They didn't get along very well because they really disagreed about what you had to do if you're a Quaker in the middle of a war. Margaret Hill Morris shows sort of another side of being a Quaker and the difficulties. She was a widow, and she moved to Burlington from Pennsylvania into, if I understand it, what had been the house used by William Franklin. And so she's right on the river, and at some point the Loyalists are firing at her house, and another point the Patriots are firing at her house. So she's caught in the middle of this, but she maintained that she was neutral, or trying at least to be neutral. Yeah, she helped the Anglican minister, the Reverend Jonathan Odell. She helped hide him from the Patriot forces at one point. And she also, when she heard news of the Battle of Trenton, she wanted to know how our boys were. How were they? Meaning she was worried about the Patriots, her neighbors who were Patriots. She's trying to be neutral, and she's clearly torn in her alliances in the middle of this war. And also one of those people caught basically, I guess you could say, in the crossfire as well. Then were also the Free Quakers. It's estimated that about a 14% maybe, or in some places more, of the Quakers actually picked up arms during the war. And most of the time when they picked up arms, they fought with the Patriots, not with the British. But the Free Quakers started in Philadelphia, and it was by a group who said defensive war is appropriate. Not only that, but we want the Quaker meetings in Philadelphia to give us one of the meeting houses. Instead of disowning us and forcing us out, we're still Quakers, even though we think you should fight. And so they wanted them to give them one of the meeting houses, which they didn't get, and they ended up building their own meeting house in Philadelphia. And as a group, they lasted until about 1830. The most famous member of the group was Betsy Ross. But there were men and women, there were others as well. And most of the literature says these were all Pennsylvania Quakers. There's several names that are clearly New Jersey names. And also on a list of the members at one point there, it says Isaac Collins from New Jersey. So this was not just Pennsylvania people. And they, as I said, they were saying that, defensive war, that this is appropriate. An example also, somebody who came from a Quaker family, although he and his brother never formally joined at the Quaker meeting. Their parents were Quakers, and the wives were Quakers, extended family were Quakers. They never joined a Quaker meeting. And that's Philemon Dickinson, the brother of the much better known Jonathan Dickinson. And I just finished reading and actually wrote something about a new book about John Dickinson. And it is a really, really interesting book. He attended the Continental Congress, but when it came to the Declaration of Independence, he didn't sign. Turned around and joined the Patriot forces and marched off to fight the British. And he also served as a governor. At one point, at the same time, governor of Delaware and the governor of Pennsylvania during the Revolution. So, hard to make a decision. He was regarded as, having betrayed his arguments against the British when he refused to sign the Declaration, but he believed in defensive war. And so he turned out to fight and to be very active even during the Revolution. Philemon Dickinson was his younger brother. both of them were born in Maryland, very wealthy Quaker family, and had a lot of property in both Delaware and Pennsylvania. And Philemon moved to New Jersey. He went to the College of, what's become the College of Pennsylvania, was I think originally the College of Philadelphia. Anyway, he moves to New Jersey. He lived in a house on the edge of Trenton, that at one point before and during the Battle of Trenton was occupied by Hessian soldiers. Okay. He became the most important militia officer in New Jersey and served in one battle with his local forces, including a lot from Hunterdon County in the war. Constant communication at some points with George Washington. He was an extremely active soldier, even with his Quaker background. In the end, when the war was over, one brother was buried in Quaker cemetery in Delaware, and the other one was buried in the Quaker cemetery in Trenton. So complicated responses, complicated loyalties. And I just think somebody really needs to write a book about Philemon Dickinson, because I don't think there's been much written about him. And I think he's really interesting. Okay, loyalists. So everybody talks about the loyalists, and loyalists were exiled and their property was confiscated, which is true. But most of the loyalists, when the war was over, stayed. They didn't leave. They stayed. And some of them who left, even if they were exiled and they lost their property, returned. So even the stories about the loyalists become complicated. So Colonel Isaac Allen is from Trenton, and he joined the British early on in the war. He was College of New Jersey, Princeton graduate, one of the 2% that weren't patriots, a lawyer, an Anglican. So there's Francis Hopkinson was an Anglican. So again, you can't find one thing that works for everybody. But Allen joined the New Jersey Volunteers, which was a loyalist group, in December of 1776, and fought with the British throughout the war, including for much of the time in the South, Savannah, and other battles in the South. When the war was over, he went with his men to Canada and stayed. There are some who go and come back, but he went to Canada and he stayed. He became a prominent lawyer and a judge there, and he did get compensated by the British for his losses. Now, some of them got compensated by the British, but if you were a patriot and you lost property, government had no money to compensate you. Just pull up your bootstraps and go back to work. So it's a little bit of irony in some of this. And there's a plaque on his house in Frederickson where he is membered, where the loyalists are celebrated, and he is membered for his service during the Revolution. The other one, Dr. Absalom Bainbridge, was raised in Maidenhead, now Lawrenceville. Also part of that 2% from the College of New Jersey, how that became loyalists. He was from a patriot family, but his wife and her family were loyalists. And when the British went through Princeton, he joined them and he left with them, and he served as a doctor through the war with the British. He was compensated by the British when the war was over, but he returned. And there are a number of loyalists that returned, some soon after the war, some years later, but they returned. There also were a few who wanted to return. One, in fact, who tried it, I know, and I'm sure there's more than one. And the neighbors were so angry, he didn't stay very long. Because these were people who had pointed out their neighbors to the British and said, oh, that's a patriot. That's a patriot. So you can burn their house down. they can burn their crops and their fields and so on. So if they try to come back, they were not forgiven so easily for some of that. But Absalom Bainbridge apparently had helped when the British went through this area. He actually helped some of the neighbors to escape. He might have been able to come back, but he doesn't, like some others. He comes back, but to New York. He doesn't come back to New Jersey. He comes back to New York. And there are examples. One of the Ogden's in Newark does the same thing. He comes back, but not to Newark. Long Island, I think, is where he comes back. So all different kinds of stories. They're all, which I find fascinating. And in working on this, I found a few new examples. So that's always, for me, that's always fun. Okay, what are the results of the revolution? Besides the fact that the estimate is it took 25 years for the new United States to recover economically from all the devastation in the war. So we tend to forget how violent and how devastating it was. And it was, especially as it said, if you live in New Jersey. But there are other results as well, too. No king. It's a British cartoon showing the horse is named America, and it's showing off the king. No king. And those who wrote New Jersey's Constitution in 1776 were really explicit about this. Also for New Jersey, it meant we had two capitals before the Revolution, and this had been true from the 17th century. You now had one. So the capital moved to Trenton, and they built a new state house in 1792. So that there was one New Jersey. If you go back to the 17th century, of course, there's two New Jerseys for a while, but now there's one New Jersey, one capital, too. So results, there are a number of results from the revolution. These are just two examples that I gave that I thought were kind of interesting. How people got over the revolution, what happened, did they become friends, and so on, depends on where you were, and all kinds of other things. So Hackensack Valley in North Jersey, a lot of Dutch. Supposedly 100 years later, they remembered who was a patriot and who was a loyalist, because those who were loyalists had come and burnt down their houses or their ancestors' houses in the farms. They didn't forget for a long time. One of the examples I found of the opposite, which really startled me, was after I finished my book. Oh, thank you. After I finished my book, a friend sent me an image from the Episcopalian church in, it's not Perth Amboy. He's not listening. Anyway, Joanne Rajapi is the Union County clerk, and she sent me a picture from the church. That Reverend Chandler, who wanted a bishop and was such a strong loyalist, he spent the whole war, 10 years till he came back in England. And he comes back, and the first thing he does, he says people welcomed him. I'm like, why'd they welcome him? He was one of the leading loyalists. Before he left, you know, if the minister across the way from him was Presbyterian, they would not walk on the same side of the street. They disliked each other even before the war. So afterwards, why did he think he was welcomed? What she sent me was the record of the first thing he did after he returned after 10 years. He married his daughter, one of his daughters, to the son of the leading patriot general in the area, to a Dayton. So sometimes they got over it fast, and sometimes it took 100 years or longer. I think it depended on where you were and some of the local stories. Okay, want to try for questions?
Oh, I don't have any questions. Do you have any questions? Anybody online have any questions?
Anybody in the audience? Anybody in the audience have any questions? Okay,
Yeah. It could be, I guess, in general, the colonists here in New Jersey, let's just say, but particularly those of German extraction, either born in Germany or, they've been here for a while. What did they think of the Hessians, the German soldiers? They're
Okay,
generally well-behaved.
yeah, okay, the most accounts that I've seen, there's some very good books on the Hessians. And this one big, I'm not gonna remember the author's name, but there's one big one that's been written in the last 5 to 10 years. So that people have been doing more and more work on it. The largest German population was Pennsylvania, and a lot of the local Germans were patriots. Now, don't ask me to explain. I don't know enough about the Pennsylvania part of this, to be sure. And supposedly also because they were, not all the Hessians went back to what becomes Germany. Some of them slipped away, they stayed, they married local women. So in New Jersey, I think some of them slip away and so on, but I've read more about what happens actually, I think, in Pennsylvania than in New Jersey. Yeah.
What was the other capital of New Jersey? Said there were two.
There were two capitals of New Jersey, Burlington and Perth Amboy. Yeah, east and west, because they had to go back to the 17th century. It's two colonies for a while, an east and a west. Trenton was not, nope. No, Trenton was, if I remember right, proposed to be the capital of the United States. And that didn't last very long, because it was very small and that idea didn't go very far.
So they chose one sort of in the middle.
Absolutely, they chose one in the middle, which is interesting because you start to look at other states right after the revolution, and the same thing kind of thing happens. The states that had capitals really near the coast, usually after the revolution, moved them further west to be closer to the larger part of the population. So Virginia goes from Williamsburg to now I'm going to blank on that, but yeah, but one after another, you look, the East Coast, they moved them. New York, yeah, moves to Albany. So yeah. Other questions? Okay, if you can come up and ask me individually if you feel more comfortable, if you want. Thank you.